How do we combat erasure?
Mm-hmm.
How do we fortify our stories, our histories, our cultural heritage, especially when it seems like there's always something threatening Black history and cultural production?
Mm-hmm. That's really wonderful. I think that threat really animates the work that we do collectively and individually. And so I think of the work by Daniel Romero. She is a YouTuber and she has a video called The Melungeon's Forbidden Ancestry. And it brought up a lot of things for me and things that we've talked about throughout our association around who is telling our history and where's this information coming from? How's it being verified? Why are records or historical materials being weaponized against us? You know,
Right.
this loss of agency, this inability to vote, land rights, ability to move freely throughout the US, this loss of heritage that Daniel speaks about, identity, traditions, criminalization, the loss of family stories, you know, family secrets, or just being in a culture that doesn't ask questions, that's really thrives on being an amnesiac, I suppose, you know. And finally, thinking about erasure, you know, and what that does
Hmm.
to families and friendships and our history as a whole, but individually, and how it really can sting sometimes. Not
Yeah.
knowing where you come from or what happened to a family member, those things matter.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miranda, and I'm here with Stephen. Welcome to our channel, the Nomadic Archivists Project. This is a space for all of us across the global Black world who are interested in archiving, Black history and culture,
Mm,
genealogy, and legacy making. On this channel, we're going to share archival tips as well as discuss the importance
mm,
of Black archiving, especially as there are real threats of
mm,
loss to the things we create and love. If you
mm,
are interested in being in community with us, please subscribe, hit the
mm.
notification button to stay up to date on all of the content that we plan to drop. So let's get into it. So one of the, I was actually, when I saw Danielle's
Mhm.
episode as well, it brought up a lot of things for me when I think about combating erasure.
Okay.
And Right. And I think that's the reason why we've built this community, the Nomadic Archivist
Mhm. Mhm.
community, is to really put people into conversations to get them thinking about
Mhm.
how we are all agents in our own destinies, right? How we are all
Responsibility. Mhm.
we're all responsible for these things, right? We can't do
Mhm.
it alone. There can't be one person thinking about like who's collecting and preserving Black
Right.
history and culture. Like we all have to be engaged and we all have to be interested.
Mhm.
And that's one of the ways in which we combat this sort of loss. And I
Mhm.
think ultimately, like combating it really for us is because it's through love. It's through loving these things that we know about ourselves, that we know about other people,
Mhm.
loving the things that we have created and the things that we've been a part of for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I
Mhm.
feel like that love is what drives so many
Oh,
people
absolutely.
to doing this
Mhm.
work. But so for me, I thought when I saw that video, especially because it is about her family, or it's about her series is about really tracing her family line. I was thinking about like how I found out about my great grandfather, John Mims,
Mhm. Mhm.
who went missing at the turn of the century, right? So I think it was around from the stories that have been passed down. What I think it was around like 1907,
Okay.
1908. We're unsure of the actual time and when he went missing.
Mhm.
My grandfather was a young boy. He must have been like 8, maybe even a little bit younger. He
Okay.
witnessed 2 white men come in through their front door of their house, chase his father out of the back door, and then never seen again, right? He just
Wow.
disappeared into
Wow.
the night. His mother never talked
Ooh.
about it, right? Nobody told
Mhm.
him what happened, right? So he just grew up
Mhm.
without a father, grew up without asking questions about what happened
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
his father.
Mhm.
And so
8
he
years
never
old.
knew, and his mother never talked about it, right? And so that trauma stayed with him, right? And it was
Mhm.
passed
Of
on down
course.
to his kids. Absolutely, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we have been searching for John Mims in my family for decades. And
Mhm.
for whatever reason, and I can't say for sure now because we don't have the evidence, the
Mm-hmm.
materials that can speak to how he went missing, where, what happened to him. We just don't know that, but we have been searching for him. And when I found out about it from my uncle, who was telling me
Mm-hmm.
the story when I was visiting him in Mississippi, because this happened in DeSoto County in
Okay.
Mississippi, um, he told me the story, and then I, became extremely interested in understanding what happened to him, and
Mm-hmm.
in picking up where they
Right.
left off in their
Mm-hmm.
research.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we really haven't been able to find more about him. I have a couple of leads that I won't talk about
Okay.
now. But
Okay.
your mind, especially growing up in this country, it goes to really negative places.
Yes,
That
of
he was a
course.
victim of some sort of racial
Violence. Yeah.
terrorism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I pray and hope that that wasn't the case. You don't
Mm-hmm.
know. We don't know at this point, but it's it. Not having, because my grandfather was Joe Mims, was a part of this generation where you didn't ask older people questions, right? You didn't
Mm-hmm.
ask your
Right.
elder questions.
Absolutely.
This information just sort of got lost, right? He couldn't ask his
Mm-hmm.
mother these questions, but had he have done that, had he been able to do that, and this is not blame
Mm-hmm.
at all, but if that conversation happened, we may know more about what happened
Mm-hmm.
to my
Could have
great
known more. Yeah.
grandfather. But right.
Absolutely.
So I found, and that's why that her um her episode was so compelling to me. In sort of
Mm-hmm.
just thinking about, like, how do we combat the erasure that happens in our own families.
Mm-hmm.
But I know for you, Stephen, you have a different
Mm-hmm.
sort of family story in a sense,
Yeah.
and yours is actually a little bit more positive because
Mm-hmm.
when you're going to talk about Dorothy Beam, who really
Mm-hmm.
who took that power back and made sure that that loss did
Mm-hmm.
not happen.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us more about
Yeah.
who's Dorothy. What did she do?
Wow. So, well, I want to just say, I hope you find more information about your great granddad. I'm really interested in his story and how it really feeds into American history at that time. He's at one point, I do believe you spoke about going searching for research, and you went to the lynching museum. You were looking for these clues just to to find some, not just evidence, but also that part of the story that would help heal the family, to
Right.
some degree. So with conversely with Dorothy Beam, who was a woman who was born in 1925 in the South, and she moved to Philadelphia, got married, was a social worker. In 1954, she had her only child, Joseph Beam, who is largely known because he founded and edited the first Black gay anthology called In the Life, a Black gay anthology published by Allison Press in 1986. Joe was working on his second book, and roughly around 2 years later, in 1988, December of 98, he passed away of HIV and AIDS complications. And his mother, Dorothy, was devastated. She was so heartbroken that all she could do was eat and sleep and watch television, she said. Um, but what she decided to do, instead of cleaning out Joe's apartment and throwing all his stuff away, she knew her son was working on a second book. So she did like the unthinkable for a lot of people. She wrote all of the contributors up until that point and said, this book is going to happen. She moved Essex Hemphill, the poet, and his cat into her duplex in Philadelphia. And they finished that book. The book became Brother to Brother, New Writings by Black Gay Men, which was published by Allison Press in 1991. And there were a flurry of interviews with Dorothy about why she did what she did. And she goes, well, I wanted people to know Joe. I didn't want people to forget him. He put a lot of work into this anthology and into the other work he did with Black gay and lesbian organizations. He was what Reginald Harris, the poet, said. He was in the internet before the internet in terms of connecting
Mm,
people and networking with
right.
people. So in addition to helping to finish the book, she actually donated Joe's papers to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City. And it not only one of the founding sort of queer collections at the Schomburg Center at that time in 1991, it also inspired the work that I do. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I want to just love on Dorothy some more, because in her interviews, she spoke about not only this notion of remembering, she just understood love as an activist tool, right? So she spoke with
Right.
people, to parents, and said, your children mean everything. And so they've come out. Now it's time for you to come out of the closet. You don't want to put people back in there. It's only a problem because you've made it a problem.
Right.
And what's great was Dorothy, after her son passed and she was doing this work, she described herself as a gay activist, as a HIV and AIDS activist. She was very dynamic, and everyone that met her, apparently, according to people who wrote about her. I went to her funeral in 2019. They spoke about her with a lot of love. She loved quilting. She appeared in several documentaries. And the first time I ever heard her speak was in a documentary, and she was just so animated, and you just want that kind of parent,
Right.
and you want to love on that kind of parent. So you just isn't one way where she's taking care of you. You want to take care of her as well. And so Joe's work impacted my work. So when I came to the Schomburg in February 98, a year later, I started the Black Gay and Lesbian Archive, which became the In the Life Archive, named in honor of Joseph Beam and the work that he did. And so there's this legacy. Joe's not my brother biologically, but he is my brother culturally, and also he's my brother because he went and thought it was important for us to write down our narratives, to document our stories in our
Right.
words. So I think you take back the narrative, the sort of mainstream narrative around queerness or women or Native Americans or trans folks or anyone, you take it back because you start to tell your own story. And part of that is not only telling the story, but also archiving it and making sure that our future people, because the future, I've been to the future, I know people are searching for you. So what are you going to do about it? And I think the more you know about your story, the more you invest in your story, the better we all are. Dorothy Beam's story, this self-authorized archivist of her son's papers, of his legacy, really inspires the work that I do, but inspired a number of people and continues to. Without people like Dorothy, like people like, or people like you, Miranda, who are determined to find out what happened or to archives, your loved one's, story, the we'd be searching for these stories. We need these people who have
Right.
decided that these things matter. And of course they do.
Right.
They matter to me. They matter to you. And it's our responsibility to do this work. It really
Right. I
is.
mean, the amazing thing about that story too is because Joe Beam, his anthology, his first anthology in the life, that was the first of its kind. Nobody was telling, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
everybody in that book, in that anthology, was essentially telling their story, right?
Yes.
And the stories that had not been told before. This
Correct.
in a time that was very, very turbulent in the US, right? In the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
early 90s, right? This was not a safe environment, especially
Mm-hmm.
for Black queer people, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
um, but yet they had the audacity to do it. And then for
Mm-hmm.
Dorothy Beam, she not only had the audacity to stand by her son, and to love on another son, to bring another son into her house,
Mm-hmm.
Essex Hempfield, who unfortunately also passed away of AIDS a few years after Brother to
Mm-hmm.
Brother was published, um, was out there. And instead of having, we talk about like family secrets, but instead of like holding this in and in her grieving too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Feeling any sort of shame around what her son was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
She knew that he had an impact that needed to be felt, right? She
Oh,
knew that
absolutely.
what he did mattered enough to pick it up again, and then enough to archive it. In his
Mm-hmm.
archive, his work actually is a part of your journey, right? It's a
Oh,
part of
absolutely.
your
Yeah.
personal journey coming out as a gay man, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, these things that we do that we sometimes think they don't matter, right? The
Mm-hmm.
small acts. I mean, Joseph Beam, this was somewhat of a big act, but what his mother did could be seen as like the smaller act of preserving his stuff
Mm-hmm.
actually has had a huge impact because
Huge
his
impact. Mm-hmm.
legacy is continuing to this day, right? I mean, things
Mm-hmm.
are happening around that anthology in the life. I mean, you wrote a book, you helped,
Mm-hmm.
you edited a book on,
Yes, yes.
in the life. You founded a archive, a Black Queer archive
Mm-hmm.
at the
Mm-hmm.
Schaumburg Center, and named it In the Life. And so, like
Mm-hmm.
that in itself is just beautiful. And it just shows like
Mm-hmm.
how, one person's um, ideas and what somebody does can really
Mm-hmm.
impact so many of us into the future, and why it's really, really important to do this work.
I like something that one of my favorite writers, Toni K. Bumbar, used to tell this story about when she'd come home from school. She was a preteen coming home from school. She said, "My grandmother, who wasn't her biological grandmother, this woman would say to her, 'So what are we pretending not to know today?'" And
Yeah.
it would knock Toni K. Bumbar out because she read it as Black people knew everything anyway, or you were faking like you didn't know. And so I bring that up when it comes to this notion of archiving, that we know our history matters and that we tell these stories, and that some of us take that extra step and archive those stories. And some of us do the oral histories and the genealogies, and they begin to see their world not as this sort of singular person, but they look at their parents, they look at their parents' stories and the migration stories, and they begin to build out a history, or these really wonderful histories that aren't being taught in schools. And
Right.
right now we're going through another wave of book bans, and you can't teach this, you can't teach critical race theory, you can't do this. These things, we were always telling these stories. It's just about how we do this work, but that we're
Right.
responsible for it, and that we know that we're responsible for it. I will go that extra step. And so Dorothy knew, I think instinctively, that the work that her son was doing was not just groundbreaking, but it was a seed for all these wonderful things that came after. The book that you spoke
Right.
about, Black Gay Genius, which was conceived by Charles Stevens, who is the director and founder of the Counter Network Project in Atlanta, a national Black gay service organization. He brought the project to me, and we co-edited the book together. It contains over 50 people talking about Joe, about in the life, brother to brother,
Mm.
but also learn from his lessons. They've learned from these, not just Joe's lessons, but the community of writers and activists that he worked within. He was a very loving man. And in his archives at the Schomburg, you can read some of his letters. This man was very passionate and very thoughtful, and
Mm.
understood the the impact, the potential impact of speaking out and speaking up.
Right.
So I think that we know that we have to do this work, and so it's exciting to be, you know,
Right.
living and thinking about archives in this way. So Dorothy passed away in 2019, and she lived
Okay.
to be 94 years old.
Wow.
And I went to her funeral with a friend of mine, Christopher Stallings, the founder of In the Life 2.0, which is an oral history and podcast project. Tiona McLeod, who's this amazing artist. And we sat and listened to people give testimony about how amazing um, Dorothy Beam was. Sometimes you go to these funerals and you go, "Oh, we must be at a different funeral because I know a different kind of person." No, these stories were
Right.
very similar about her generosity, her kindness, her activism, which really heartening to me, because sometimes at funerals you may not hear the more, you may not hear certain stories. And so I am very excited, or was very excited, to be there and to honor her in that way. And she continues to live through not just Joe, but her own work. Dorothy is exceptionally, she lives within me, and she lives within a number of people who she inspired to do this work. She's a singular figure, a beacon for the kind of archiving and memory work we need to do. I want to say this, closing out with Dorothy. and she was speaking. It's 1991. The book Brother to Brother was just published, and she's doing a flurry of interviews. And one of the interviews that she did with, I think, the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1991 was, I thought this gay business was a big problem. It's not a big problem. You made a problem out of it. I want other parents to see that it is no disgrace having a gay child. The disgrace is when you try to put it in the closet. Your children are coming out. Now it is your turn to come out. So she's giving these amazing instructions as well,
Right.
in addition to doing this work.
Marching orders.
I
call to action.
I'm trying, Dorothy. We're trying. A lot of us are trying.
Yes, this is our call to action.
Yes.
To honor Miss Dorothy Beam, a remarkable woman. So we encourage you guys, to, if you have family stories, or if you have these types of things, these types of stories where, there's this agency and this awareness that, that our stories matter. And these are the types of things that have been done in order to honor the stories. Drop it in the comments,
Please.
Share what you've done, or what you've seen done that has inspired you in some way, or has impacted your life because somebody else took the time to do it. Somebody else took the time to put it in an archive, or somebody else took the time to share it. How it has impacted you. We'd love to hear about it. Also, if you're really interested in hearing more, just family stories from people from all over the world, just sharing anything and everything, something personal, a family member, or a situation that happened to them. We have a podcast called In the Telling, and we are now migrating it over to YouTube. We've got 3 seasons. Our 4th season is on the way. It's in the cooker. So, definitely subscribe, and we will drop the information, the link to the podcast as well in the description. Thank you so much for joining us for our conversation today, and look for more content soon.